talking to Trebor Scholz at the new school. You can see in the background. So tell us what's exciting to you about the upcoming DML conference.
Well, with regards to the 2011 Designing Learning Futures conference, I'm especially interested in the way the conference frames a critique of the old banking model of education, with the teacher being the knowledge gatekeeper, and describing this move to teachers as learning experts, as mentors, as motivators, and technology integrators, as Katie Salen puts it. And so this is interesting to me, in addition to the fact that the MacArthur research describes the move from education to learning, and also a move from the kind of brick and mortar institution to informal networks as locations for learning, where learning is taking place. Right? So I think these kind of three things are interesting to me overall in the conference. In particular, and mostly in relation to what I'm working on, I'm interested in these new collectives that are described in the conference call. And so here I'm particularly fascinated by these do-it-yourself universities, right? And we have seen, so I'm quite interested in this kind of peer learning and these peer learning collectives. There are very many, from the University Free Copenhagen to the Slow University Warsaw to very many others, EDU Factory, University of Openness, many of whom you are familiar with. And so I'm quite interested in the critique that they are framing of the university and of higher education, and in the alternatives that they offer to this model, right? And so on one hand, I'm really interested in that, and if you think of Bill Reading's The University in Ruins, or Anja Kamenet's DIYU, these books are all kind of framing this kind of critique, right? Sort of bringing to the front that basically student loans are spiraling and education becomes as unaffordable as a Rolls-Royce. And at the same time, I'm also a little cautious about this emphasis on peer learning. So just to be really, really clear, I'm in full support and very interested in peer learning networks and peer learning. But at the same time, I can also see this in relation to recent moves of the for-profit education sector, which basically is very much in favor of these peer networks and anything that draws attention and funds away from the university. So there's this attempt that is also in front of Congress, really to influence the government to support for-profit education, for instance, taking on defaulting student loans from those institutions that are then paid by the government, by the taxpayer. And so these two paths I see in parallel, right? So on the one hand, you have these peer networks, and on the other hand, you have this for-profit education sector. And so I see the danger to basically forget that there's also an effort at the same time to defund public universities. And that's an effort that I would not sign on to. So this is sort of a tension for me that I see, right?
Well, the peer learning, I bet you know this really well. It's certainly something that I encounter. The students that I engage with have many years of learned helplessness behind that banking model, that they are very good at banking the knowledge that is delivered to them. And they take a little bit of reprogramming or reframing in order to get into this peer learning business. In my experience, that's a lot of work on the instructor's part. I would think as a for-profit university you would think of peer learning as a way to maybe cut your costs. But actually, in my experience, in order to do the modeling and facilitating and catalyzing, the instructor has to spend a lot more time. It's much easier to compose a lecture and deliver it year after year than it is to comment on your student blogs and participate in forums. It's I think,
of course. But you know what I'm talking about. I'm more concerned with efforts that basically try to make the university somewhat irrelevant or describe the university as something that's somewhat passé and taken over by peer-to-peer learning efforts. And I think that is the danger. This, I think, which is something I think that the university and institutions of higher education surely need reform, right? There's no question about it. But I do not think that they are obsolete and will dissolve, right? I'm not in favor of that. But I can certainly see the power of peer learning, informal peer learning networks, and I think we really have to figure out how to plug into them.
So I'm sure you do it in your classes. I know that you do empower your students and use social media and engage in inquiry rather than strict delivery. How do you think universities are going to begin coping with that outside of the enthusiasts like you and I?
Yeah, well, I think there has to be a real good understanding, and this is of the outside, after school space, which you would call it in K-12. So like an understanding how the kind of discursive intensity of the class can be continued also until the next class section. So for instance, through continuing discussions on seismic, right? Or finding ways of having, Facebook open office hours, things like that. So just to find ways of continuing this momentum and to also plug into these conversations that are taking place anyway, right? Conversations between students. And so I think this kind of hybridization is what universities, what institutions of higher education really need.
Thanks, Trevor.
So in relation to my own work, I'm really interested in a digital fluency of students, in particular in relation to value fluency. So something that I would call value fluency, which means that students should be aware of the economic value that they create through their online presence, right? But most importantly, I relate this conference, the DML 2011 conference, to a summit that I'm convening for the fall of October 2011. It's called Mobility Shifts. It's an International Future of Learning Summit. And hopefully many of the questions that will be discussed in Los Angeles in March can be continued in October in New York. And the added focus for this October event is a decisively international angle. So we will really try to bring people from sub-Saharan Africa, Brazil, India, China, Japan, to discuss these very same issues, to really mobilize this discourse that we have going on here on a more global scale. Thanks so much, Howard.
Wonderful.